Glory to God. Good to be back with you. Back in the boogie down Bronx. Philadelphia. It's interesting. Some nice sights to see. I saw the Liberty Bell for the first time. Back to Independence Hall, where they signed the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. There's some nice sights in Philadelphia. The only problem is you've got too many Philadelphians there. What can I tell you? Same thing I might add with my own hometown in New York. You know, it would be great if we didn't have all these New Yorkers, but what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Part 4, Hebrews, the heroes of faithfulness. And yes, I said faithfulness, not faith, not right think, not warm and fuzzy thoughts about Jesus, but faithfulness to God. That's what Hebrews chapter 11 is about. And I believe this is why, Martin, I said this in an earlier part 1, part 2. Martin Luther did not want this book in the New Testament canon because it calls him a liar. It calls all sola fideists liars. Free grace, Calvinists, easy believers of every stripe. You are called a liar by Hebrews chapter 11 because faith equals faithfulness. And I'm going to show that to you again here in part 4. Now, in parts 1, 2, and 3, I'm leading up to the text. I know it's been a long preparation, 2 hours worth, it seems like, maybe longer, I don't know. But it was necessary to talk about the context. It was necessary to talk about how case endings of noun describe what they do in the sentence, their function in the sentence, the case endings. These little labels that are attached to nouns tell you what those nouns do in a sentence. And that's really important in Hebrews chapter 11, because there's a particular case ending which determines the meaning of that noun faith, which should have been translated faithfulness. But we know sola fideis, the people who put the original languages into English originally. These people did not believe in works salvation, and faithfulness sounds a whole lot like works, doesn't it? That's because it is a certain type of works. It's not works of the Torah, but it is human effort. Anyway, let me not get on a tangent here. I have a number of slides to show you. I'm going to review briefly the first 3 parts. For those of you who haven't gotten around to see it yet, those first 3 parts, quickly I'm going to go through it. I'll hit the highlights of it. You really need to see those first 3 parts if you really want to understand this in full, the way you should. Or if you have any doubts about what I'm saying in part 4, go back to the first 3 parts, have a look. I'm not going to replay that whole scene again here. I'm not going to redo the whole hour again in each of those 3 parts, but I will briefly rehearse what it was that we went through, because here, as we actually get into the text, we've only gotten into the first 3 verses of Hebrews chapter 11 and these 3 parts, and we're going to look at them again today. But the preparation in those first 3 parts really is essential, because we have been trained to think that faith in Hebrews chapter 11 is talking about our thought life, our wonderful, trusting thought life, when in actuality, it's talking about fidelity to King Jesus, fidelity to God despite the persecution. Yet we've been trained, again, since our first weeks in Sunday school, to think, no, faithfulness is a work, and we're not saved by works. We're saved by faith. We're saved by thinking the right things. My question to these people who want to tell you that, who've been gaslighting us with that for centuries, why is mental activity, willful mental activity, why is that not a work? Is lust a work? Is idolatry a work? How about hatred? How about envy? All these things that these mental actions that Paul describes in Galatians 5 from 19 to 22, love, joy, peace, they're not works, really. And you saying, my critics tell me, Charlie, you're trusting in your works. And I reply to them, you're trusting in your trust, which is also a work. Yeah, it's a mental work. You're telling me that internal mental activity is not something you do? How about if you pray silently? Are you doing anything? Yeah, you are. Your idea of a work is something that is visible. That's not Paul's idea of a work. Paul's idea of a work was something that the Torah prescribed to atone for sin. He was an ex-Pharisee. Just look at Romans chapter 2, verses 6 through 8. Hebrews is not written by Paul. Some people thought it was, but it isn't. Look at Romans 2, verses 6 through 8. You'll see lots of works there that Paul talks about that you need to do to be justified on Judgment Day. 2 Corinthians 5:10. We all have to stand before the judgment seat of Christ to answer for the things that are done in the body. How does that jive with your, it's all about my mental activity? It's all about my correct religious thinking. That's the only thing that's going to save me. Okay. I won't get off on that tangent. Got 18 slides to show you. Let me get started. Stand by. Yeah, it's approximately 18 slides to show you in this one. I think I'd like to get through verse 10, Hebrews 11:10, but I'm really through with predictions for this series because originally I thought this was Hebrews chapter 11. I thought it was going to be part of another series I was doing, Free Grace, Easy Believism, Proof Text Debunked. I have 11 or 12 videos in that series. I thought this was going to be another one. And then I realized this is going on for several parts. I might as well make a separate playlist just for this, which is what I'm doing. Okay. So I'm not going to predict how far we're going to get in this one. Hopefully we'll get through the first 10 verses today. But I want to rehash quickly as I can here. For those of you who still haven't seen the first three parts, what we were talking about in those first three parts. The first part started off with a discussion of the purpose of the letter, which is an exhortation to faithfulness. This is from the Wikipedia article on the Epistle to the Hebrews. And it talks about some of the things that we talked about in part one. It says, scholars of Greek consider it, Hebrews, writing to be more polished and eloquent than any other book of the New Testament. And the very carefully composed and studied Greek of Hebrews is not Paul's spontaneous, volatile, contextual Greek. This is another reason why we don't think Paul wrote this, not himself anyway. And it's conceivable an amanuensis, someone else who was writing for him, did that. But this Greek, and I remember hearing this also in seminary when I took a graduate course on this book 20 years ago now at Liberty University. The professor made a point of emphasizing that this particular letter here, this is probably the sharpest of the Greek. This letter writer here was more skilled at Greek than any of the other New Testament writers. And that's another reason they think it probably wasn't Paul. It could have been Luke. It might have been Apollos. It was somebody who grew up speaking Greek and someone who had some considerable education like Apollos, like Dr. Luke. No one really knows. In any case, it is a sophisticated use of the Koine language, which is important for our purposes because we have to understand that this writer here chose his words carefully. He chose the construction of those words carefully. He knew what he was doing, the way he wrote. Anyway, it goes on here in Wikipedia. Some scholars believe this letter was written for Jewish Christians who lived in Jerusalem. And yeah, quite obviously, it was. We don't know about Jerusalem, but for certain it was written for Jewish Christians, because this letter cites the Old Testament more than any other New Testament book. Every chapter, all 13 chapters, are full of quotations to Old Testament prophets, Old Testament writers, allusions to Old Testament events, and especially in Hebrews chapter 11, where you go through a whole litany of Old Testament heroes. So, yes, this was written for Jewish Christians because Gentile Christians wouldn't have known half of the quotes that the author uses. Gentile Christians probably would not have been familiar with all the references, but Jewish Christians knew who this writer was talking about, and they knew who he was talking about in Hebrews chapter 11. So the Wikipedia article says its essential purpose was to exhort Christians to persevere in the face of persecution. That was a lot of persecution in Jerusalem for Christians, as you can imagine, less than 30 years after the resurrection. At this time, certain believers were considering turning back to Judaism and to the Jewish system of law to escape being persecuted for believing Jesus to be the Messiah, to be the King, the Son of God. All right, let me move on here. Yeah, I want to do a quick grammar review because we got into this in part 2. It's really important to understand the case endings for nouns in this particular letter, because in this chapter, Hebrews chapter 11, the author uses a particular case ending for the word faith, which tells us what faith means in that chapter. He uses the dative case ending, which is the indirect object. I'm going to talk about that again in a minute. He uses this particular case ending more than any other New Testament author. This dative case ending for the noun, the Koine noun pistis, gets translated faith. This ending, the dative case ending, gets attached to that noun pistis a total of 58 times in the New Testament. So the noun itself appears 244 times. It gets put into this dative case ending 58 times. In the entire New Testament, 58 times, but 18 of those times is in Hebrews chapter 11. So this polished writer wanted that noun faith in the dative case. He was doing something with that. And I'm going to show you what he was doing with that. And if you can understand what he was doing with that noun in the dative case, then you'll know what faith is talking about in Hebrews chapter 11. And if you know what it's talking about in Hebrews chapter 11, you're going to know what it's talking about in the New Testament writ large. And that's why I'm spending all this time on this particular New Testament chapter. Because like I said, it calls sola fide, as they understand fide. It calls sola fide a liar. It calls easy believism a liar. It calls Charles Jennings and Praise I Am and Your Friendly Hood and a bunch of other YouTube preaching quacks, it calls all of them liars. Hebrews chapter 11 calls you a liar. Kevin's biblical discussions, Ram Gould, the rest of you preaching quacks who are trying to gaslight us that all we have to do is think those warm and fuzzy thoughts, trusting that we're righteous and it's all done. No, that's not what the author of the letter to the Hebrews was trying to tell these persecuted Christians. He was trying to tell them that it was their faithfulness that would see them through. All right, let me do this quick grammar review, and I'm not going to wear you out with the grammar, but again, I want you to pay attention a little bit to the dative case ending. You don't have to memorize all the stuff. You can come back and look at it if you want. But I just want to show you how it works in Koine. It's different than in English. We don't use case endings. We use prepositions. We'll use of, with, to, in, besides, among. We use a bunch of prepositions. We don't put things, we don't attach a syllable to the last part of the noun to explain its function in the sentence. They do that in Koine, and you need to recognize it. And it doesn't translate well into English because you'll see the same, it's constructed in English, the same faith, all right? Even though in Koine, faith has three or four different endings, at least. This word pistis, it'll be constructed with three different endings after that, in addition to the pistis, in addition to the nominative case. It will be constructed three other different ways. We don't see that in English. We just see faith. And that's why there's so much confusion here. So let me go through this. A quick grammar review. I gave an example sentence for you. Charlie Michaels, the subject, made his unregenerate critics. And yes, you are unregenerate, my critics. You know you are. You know you wouldn't know the Holy Ghost from the Ghost of Christmas Past, so you're unregenerate. Charlie Michaels made his unregenerate critics this video, and it's the fourth of the series. Okay, so in this sentence, I'm the subject, made is the verb. His unregenerate critics is the indirect object. This video is the direct object, and it's the fourth of the series. We'll go into that possessive case with the fourth of the series there. Okay, so very quickly, in Koine, Charlie Michaels, the subject, I'm doing the action of the verb made. So I would be constructed in the nominative case. All right, that's a little label at the end of the noun, tells me what my function is in the sentence. I'm the subject. The noun video, which receives the action of the verb made directly. Charlie Michaels made the video, okay? The video is receiving the action of the verb, so that would be constructed in the accusative case. It's the direct object. The plural noun critics are the indirect recipients of the verb made. They're affected by that verb, but they're not the direct, they don't receive the direct action of it. And so this noun would be constructed in the dative case. And this dative case is what we're going to see in Hebrews chapter 11, used again and again and again, and for a reason. The indirect recipients of the verb. All right. Finally, the noun series at the end of the sentence. Series possesses the fourth video. This noun would receive the genitive case ending. It shows possession. There's another case ending for nouns called vocative. We don't have to worry about that for Hebrews chapter 11. So just this was the subject of part 2. Maybe I went a little bit too far with it. I don't know if it helped. We'll see here. I'm hoping that you'll just keep in mind that the author of Hebrews chapter 11 constructed this word that gets translated faith. He constructed that word in a particular way. He constructed it in the dative case, okay, because it's going to be the recipient of a certain action. We'll get into it in a minute here. All right, just to go over this idea of the indirect object, because again, the dative case for Greek describes the indirect object of the sentence. So just for fun here, okay, I want to go over a real quick thing. I want to ask you if you can identify the indirect object in these sentences. We have 3 sentences here. I want you to identify the indirect object, not the direct object, the indirect. Okay, first one, the judge owes his great reputation to honesty. The judge owes. Well, the subject here, of course, is the judge. The judge. That's the subject of the sentence. What's the verb? Owes. That's the action, right? And what is the direct object of the verb? Well, it's his great reputation. The verb owes is acting on his great reputation. To honesty. This here is acting as a noun, but it's the indirect object. Okay. The judge doesn't owe honesty. He owes his great reputation to honesty. Another thing you need to observe here quickly, when, as I mentioned this in part 2, when the noun is in the dative case, the preposition in English is going to be to, for, or with. It's not going to be by, it's not going to be through, and it's not going to be in. But unfortunately, our Protestant translators used by, used in, and through wherever they saw the noun that gets translated faith. When it was in the dative case in the New Testament, they almost in every case used the wrong preposition. Because to use to or for or with faith would require works. Sounds like cooperation. But if you say in faith, by faith, through faith, as they do in Hebrews chapter 11, then you're thinking faith is the verb. It's the instrument. It's the means of achieving. It's the agency. Now, it's a cause, all right. It's a reason, but it's not a verb. It's not doing anything. You'll see again as we get into Hebrews chapter 11. Let's try the second sentence. For heroism, the firefighter was decorated. For heroism, the firefighter was decorated. Okay, so what's the subject of the sentence? Subject is the firefighter, of course. What's the verb? Decorated. And you can say, oh, this is an auxiliary verb here. It's a supporting verb. We call it an auxiliary verb. Was decorated. That's the verb. The subject is here. Okay, and what is the indirect object? Right here, heroism. We know this because of the preposition for heroism. And again here, just to save time, for justice is the indirect object. The death penalty here is the direct object of the verb inflicted. Okay? This would receive the dative case. I'm sorry, the accusative case, it's the direct object. This is the verb. For justice, indirect object. All right, let me try not to confuse you too much here and moving along. As I said earlier, this particular author referenced the Old Testament more than any other New Testament author. That's the reason this letter has been called the letter to the Hebrews. There's no direct addressees. The scholarship assumes he is writing to Jewish writers. And one of the literary devices that this author uses is personification. Now, I said in part 3 that Hebrews chapter 11, the inspiration for that actually comes from an apocryphal book called Sirach, or some people call it Ecclesiasticus. And the last 7 chapters of Ecclesiasticus, or Sirach if you prefer, it's all about the heroes of faithfulness. And this is what the author of Hebrews chapter 11 is channeling in chapter 11, the heroes of faith. He is referring basically to the same sort of group of heroes that are mentioned in this work from the intertestamental period, which would have been very familiar to his readers, Sirach. It's a work of Hebrew wisdom literature. And this is another work of Hebrew wisdom literature, which we're familiar with. It's called Proverbs. It's from that particular genre we call Hebrew wisdom literature. Proverbs, Psalms, Song of Solomon. Okay. There are, I believe, a total of 6. But Proverbs chapter 8, the author of Proverbs, nobody's really sure who that is, where they think it could be Solomon. But in chapter 8, the author personifies a virtue called wisdom. So personification is a figure of speech. It's where you take an idea or a thing and you give it human attributes. And I believe in Hebrews chapter 11, the author is going to do the same thing with faithfulness. He's going to personify faithfulness. And that's why he's going to use faithfulness as an indirect object, as a noun that is receiving the action. It's benefiting from the action, and it's the cause of the action, and it's the reason for the action in the sentence. All right, quickly here. Doth not wisdom cry, and understanding put forth her voice? She standeth in the top of high places, by the way, in the places of the paths. So here, wisdom is called a she. The author of Hebrews would have been very familiar with this wisdom literature. Again, he's a very polished writer. He knows the Old Testament backwards and forwards. He knew the book of Sirach. He would have been very familiar with Proverbs chapter 8. And so I'm certain he is doing the same thing in Hebrews chapter 11. He is personifying faithfulness. You'll see as we look at it. Yeah, before we get into this, again, I'm going to redo the first 3 verses here, and hopefully we'll get to verse 10 here today. But the conclusion of Hebrews 10, again, this is not, these 2 verses that come before that conclude Hebrews 10, it's not a prelude to a discussion about soteriology. Again, this is like so many other passages in this letter. This is an exhortation to faithfulness. Here, the author, again, like I said, he was very familiar with the Old Testament. Here he quotes the prophet Habakkuk. And he's reading from the 70 version, of course, like all of the New Testament writers did, like Jesus did, like Paul did. We don't have our version of the Old Testament. That's not going to exist for another 800 years. So he had the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. And he quotes, just like Paul quotes in his letter to the Galatians 3:11, and also in his letters to the Romans, he quotes the same passage from Habakkuk. Habakkuk chapter 2 and verse 3 and 4. But my righteous one will live by my faithfulness. And God is the speaker here, so we know it's faithfulness. We're not talking about my righteous one will live by God's thought life. No, by God's willingness to honor his promises. But my righteous one will live by my faithfulness. My soul takes no pleasure and anyone who shrinks back. Okay? This is not a discussion of soteriology. This is a discussion of who's going to stay and who's going to leave. Verse 39, but we are not among those who shrink back and so are lost, but among those who have faithfulness and so preserve our souls. I'm sorry, but you can't go the last 14. Anyone who looks at the last 14 verses of Hebrews chapter 10 and thinks that this is a discussion about thought life, about being willing to suspend disbelief about something, no. This is a discussion about being willing to stay true to King Jesus despite the persecution. And this is how we start Hebrews chapter 11. So stand by it, and that's exactly what we're going to do. Restart Hebrews chapter 11. So we're going to start from Hebrews 11:1. For those of you who missed the end of part 3, I'll just start from the beginning, Hebrews 1, and we'll try and go through the first 10 verses. But I just want to remind you, the question we're trying to settle here is, what does faith mean in Hebrews chapter 11? What is he talking about? Is he talking about confidence that Jesus actually rose from the grave? Confidence that the gospel message that they heard was really true? Or is he talking about fidelity to the king in the face of brutal persecution? Part 1, I spent a lot of time showing you the context, showing you the several warning passages, showing you the 14 verses that come before Hebrews 11 and the 13 verses that come after. And they're not talking about thought life. They're not talking about a theory of salvation. They're talking about staying true despite persecution. That's the theme of the letter. That's the purpose of the letter. This author is trying to encourage his readers to remain Christians, not to backslide to the temple cult, not to apostatize. His purpose is to get them to stay with the fellowship, because it's getting very difficult to stay with the fellowship. And things are going to get a lot worse. Again, these apostles of Jesus, all of them are martyred. The possible exception of John, they're all going to be horribly martyred, including Paul himself. We think of faithfulness quite a bit differently than they would. We here in the West, we think, some of us think, we should be rewarded for believing in miracles. That's what some people who think, wow, trusting that the gospel is actually true, that's what's going to make me righteous, because God has an obligation to reward me for actually believing these incredible stories I've been reading. They're actually true. No, that's not the way the original readers would have understood faith. The ability to suspend disbelief in stories about miracles. That's not what faith meant to them. These were not materialists. As I showed again in part 3, they didn't have a secular humanist worldview. It would not have been very difficult for them to believe in miracles. In fact, they were moving in the gifts of the Spirit, as it said in chapter 2 and verse 4 in Hebrews. The word, the message of the gospel had been attested to them with signs and wonders and miracles. So it's not a matter of belief. What it is a matter of is staying true to King Jesus when maybe your kids can get thrown into the lion's den. Okay, maybe you're going to be run out of town. Your business is going to be shut down. Nobody's speaking to you anymore because they found out you're a Christian. So that's what this chapter is about. And I believe in this chapter, this author, who was so familiar with the work of Sirach, who was familiar with Hebrews wisdom literature, and the use of personification. He's going to personify faithfulness, and in almost like a lyrical, poetic way. He's going to use the heroes of faithfulness, people that his readers would have known, would have been very familiar with. People like Moses, people like Aaron, people like Jeremiah, Isaiah, Noah, the heroes of the Old Testament, those who were the truest to God, people who became pariahs in their own way, who suffered, who, like his readers, were threatened because they had chosen to pick up their cross, so to speak, and to follow that hard road that leads to life. And that's what the author of this letter is trying to encourage his readers to do. He's not trying to encourage them to suspend disbelief in miracles. That's our 21st century issue. It wasn't their first century issue. But let me get back to the text. All right, so back to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1 through 3, and we're using the good old King James Version because, as I said in part 3, we know that there has been no advances in the study of the ancient languages since the 18th century. There's been no major archaeological discoveries since 1610, and we know that linguistics and other scholarly disciplines, lower criticism, all these things that go into Bible translation, all these scholarly disciplines that are necessary to translate the Bible. There's been no improvement in any of them since 1610, so we need to go with the King James Version. And if I don't, some of you out there looking at this are going to say, well, he's using a corrupt text, so I can safely disregard everything he's saying about Hebrews chapter 11 because, look, he's using one of those modern translations. That's why he's so confused. Okay, so we're going to use your favorite text, skeptics, the King James Version, named in honor of that witch hunting, witch torturing, witch executing bisexual King James the First. All right, so verse 1. Now faith, pistis. When you see this word faith, it's coming from G4102. It could be in one of 4 different case endings, and I believe in Hebrews chapter 11, it gets constructed in all 4 case endings, everything but the vocative case. All right, so here it's constructed in the nominative case. I have the case here in red. I can highlight it. There we are. Yeah, it's the nominative case, which means it is the subject of the sentence. That's the way they told the reader, this noun here, its job in the sentence is to be the subject of the sentence. All right, so pistis. Also, we have it, it's a feminine and singular noun. Pistis. The information in the blue brackets is not part of the original text. I'm adding this explanatory information here. Okay, the dark, the regular black print, that's the original text. I should say the original translation. The blue is my own information, which I'm adding to help you. I hope it does help. So, belief, trust, faithfulness. These are the possible denotations of pistis, faith. Our job is to figure out which one he's talking about. Is it belief? Is it trust? Or is it faithfulness? You've heard my reasons for why it should be faithfulness. Now, faithfulness is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Let's try it the other way. Now, belief is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Does that make sense to you? Or how about this? Now, trust is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Does trust have a substance? No. Trust is a mental action. It belongs to an entirely different domain of reality, which we, for lack of a better term might call spirit. No, faithfulness, that is the substance. That is something that we can see. And I believe he's going to personify here in Hebrews chapter 11. He's already trying to make faithfulness as something substantial in verse 1. He's going to personify faithfulness throughout the chapter. But in verse 1, he's setting the stage for it. Now, faithfulness is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good report. Through faith. And here, this noun, this pistis noun, is constructed in the dative case. And they translated this one word using two words, through faith. Again, the preposition is attached to the noun stem. P-I-S-T, that's the noun stem. E-I, this is the transliteration of the original word, which the E-I would have been the Greek letter epsilon and iota. Okay, in English transliteration, we get piste. And the EI tells us that this is in the dative case. That means this word is, what did I say about indirect objects? Yes, it's the recipient. Okay, it's acted upon by the verb. Through faith, we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. Here in verse 3, the translators played fast and loose by choosing the preposition through. The first word here in verse 3, through faith. There's a different way to understand, different way to interpret this word piste, which starts verse 3. And as I said in part 2, the construction of koine is translated at the sentence level. And it is a choice. It is a translator's choice, just like the denotations of words, which one to choose, which preposition to choose is a translator's choice. So also where to begin and end a sentence in koine is a translator's choice. And I showed with the example of Revelation 13:8 that English translators move around words all the time. It's not set in stone. How you choose to arrange these words, where you choose to begin a sentence and end a sentence, it's not set in stone. We believe that the original texts are inerrant. We don't necessarily make the same commitment to translators that they are inerrant, that they are infallible. No, they were human beings, and some of them were agenda-driven human beings. Let's look at my translation of verses 1 through 3. This is how I believe 1 through 3 should be read and understood. And again, if you don't get these first 3 verses right, you're not going to understand anything else in Hebrews chapter 11. Faithfulness, that is the tangible physical substance of things hoped for. The physical substance of things hoped for. Your faithfulness is something we can see. Your faithfulness is something we can feel. If you didn't report us, you didn't rat us out as Christians, yeah, we felt that. And if you did if you chose to rat us out and say, yo, this, my neighbor here, he's also part of the church, well, we would have felt that too. Faithfulness is the tangible physical substance of things hoped for, the visible evidence of things not seen, like your sincere devotion. So with this display of fidelity, the ancients were commended for faithfulness. I don't know if you noticed here, but I have faithfulness as the last word of verse 2, not the first word, of verse 3. It's an important difference, and I think it's justified. Again, for faithfulness, with the noun in the dative case, is more appropriate than through faithfulness, because through faithfulness makes it sound like it's a verb. It's a subtle difference, but an important one. For faithfulness. Faithfulness is a thing, it's a noun, and it's going to be personified in Hebrews chapter 11. Similarly, we understand the universe to have been formed by the command of God, so that things that are visible were made from things not visible. We don't have to, how would we understand the universe to have been formed by the command of God so that things are visible? Why do we need faith to understand that? We don't need faith to understand that. We understand the universe to have been formed by the command of God so that things that are visible were made from things not visible, like God's power. We can't see God's power. So he's trying to say that there are certain things that we can't see, but we still understand that they have a way to cause things. Let's move along here. Hebrews 11:4. Faithful Abel. All right, here again, the sentence starts with pistis, and the Protestant translators translate that one word pistis as by faith. Again, it's an indirect object. It's in the dative case. It means either confidence or fidelity. And they went with by faith, not for faith, by faith. Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and by it he being dead yet speaketh. All right, let's assume for a minute belief or confidence is being spoken of, not faithfulness, not sincerity. By belief, by confidence, Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain. Fine. You want to choose that denotation? Now tell me what his confidence was in. What was he believing, Abel? Was he believing in Jesus? No, Jesus wouldn't exist for many thousands of years. What was he believing in? That he had a savior for his sin? Well, what indication do we have that he was even concerned about sin? No. For the sake of faithfulness, Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice. We'll get into that in a minute here. Go to verse 5. Enoch. By, again, they translate pistis, this one word. Pistis in the dative case, transliterated pistis. It's translated by faith. As we're going to see throughout all of Hebrews chapter 11, the King James Version took this noun in the dative case, which should have been translated for faithfulness, and they went with by faith, giving you the feeling that faith is the agent, it's the cause, it's the instrument of change, it's the verb. It's very subtle what they did here, but if you pick up on it, you'll understand you were trying to be spun here. By faith, Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and was not found because God had translated. For before his translation, he had this testimony that he pleased God. And the author gets his information about Enoch from that intertestamental book I talked about, the apocryphal book of Sirach, chapters 44 and 49. Let's have a look at how verses 4 and 5 should be read and understood. For his faithfulness to be made plain for all to see, Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and by it, his faithfulness, he being yet dead, speaketh to us. Verse 5, for his faithfulness to be recognized publicly. Enoch was translated that he should not see death and was not found because God had translated him. For before his translation, he had this testimony that he pleased God. Again, for faithfulness. This noun is in the dative case. That means with, to, or for. Doesn't mean by or through or in. Okay. You would say in faithfulness. What is that? I don't know. That's kind of a awkward translation. But for faithfulness. And again, I believe here, this is the start of the author personifying this virtue, faithfulness. Remember in Proverbs 8, wisdom is personified. It's called she. Here, he's personified faithfulness because Abel and Enoch, what they are doing, it is affecting faithfulness. It's for faithfulness. Faithfulness is the reason, but it's also the beneficiary. What they do proves it. Their actions affect the noun. That's why it's put in the indirect object. What they did by offering a more excellent sacrifice, faithfulness is affected by that. It may take a couple of times to look at it to see what I'm talking about. It's a little tricky. It really is. But this subtle difference, you really need to catch that to understand that in Hebrews chapter 11, the author is not just praising the heroes of faith, he's praising a virtue called faithfulness. Just as in Proverbs, wisdom is praised. Anyway, let's move along here. In Hebrews 11:6, again, more tricky semantics. Semantics is the way that you arrange the words in a sentence. And as I've said before, koine gets translated at the sentence level. You don't translate word for word. It would make no sense. You couldn't read it in English. Wycliffe was the first one to do that in the late 1300s. He translated the Latin word for word into English. Nobody could understand it. One of his disciples eventually translated it at the sentence level. But at any rate, you have to be very careful the way you arrange the nouns, where you put them in an English sentence, because in English, the meaning of the sentence is determined by the word order. Not so in koine. In koine, you can move words around in lots of different places, and you really have to make decisions about how they should be rearranged into English. And the way you do that, again, is by the case endings. You have to know what their function in the sentence is, and that's how they turn them around. But it's not a matter of word order in koine. But let me not get too far again into that. See part 2 if you're confused about that. Here we are in verse 6. It says, but without faith. And again, this is faithfulness. This is the same construction of the noun faith that is used in Hebrews 10:38 and 10:39. The last two verses before chapter 11, this noun is constructed in the genitive case, possessed of faith. Means it possesses the quality of the noun, but without faith, without faithfulness. Okay. Again, he's quoting from Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4. That's where he gets the meaning of this noun, pistios. But without faith, faithfulness, it is impossible to please him, God. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. Now, this comma here is not in the original text. I should put it in red here as a warning. It's not in the original. There is no punctuation in the original text. There's no periods, there's no semicolons, no commas. They were added to the text. And again, these are decisions that are made by translators, and they're not set in stone. Let's have a look at how this could be better understood. But without your faithfulness, it is impossible to please him. For he that comes to God must believe both that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. Okay, so it's not enough to just to believe God. You have to believe that he rewards those who seek him. So how does this jive with your simply believe theory, free grace people? How does that work? If this author is saying it's not enough just to believe that he is, you have to diligently seek him. In fact, didn't Jeremiah say that? You will find me when you seek me with your whole heart. Moving on here. All right, faithful Noah. Here we are with the King James version of it. By faith, again, the single word pistis in the dative case, translated by faith. Very misleading. It looks like faith is an agency. It looks like it's a verb. And you're choosing it. We've all been trained to think that it's a verb talking about trust. So people look at that, especially in the free grace movement, and they, or any sola fideist, when they see this first two words, by faith, they're thinking, oh, by trust. No. If you go with by trust, Noah, you have to answer the question, trust in what? What was his trust? Anyway, Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house, by the which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is by faith. Okay. Now this is in the accusative case. That means it's direct object of the verb. And it's, again, they rearrange this to where you're not even sure where that verb is, but it is the object of the verb became. You could rearrange this sentence. The translators could have rearranged this sentence to say, and they probably should have, became by faith. But actually it should be became for faith, or for faith became. I'll show you in a moment. In any case, I want to point out here, this is another reason why I went through the 4 different cases. You see, we see this word faith in English. We see it up here and down here. And we think it's the same word, but it isn't. It's doing a different job. It means different things because it's constructed with different case endings. And that's why I belabored this point in part 2. You really need to examine the case endings of this noun, faith, in Hebrews chapter 11 to understand what faith meant to the original readers of this. It's different. If you just looking at the King James version here, you see the same word faith and you're thinking that it's trust. You're run amok. You're at sea. Okay, let me move on to the way Hebrews 11:7 should be read and understood. For his faithfulness to be made obvious, Noah, being warned of God of things not yet seen, moved with caution and prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which obedience he, Noah, condemned the God-despising world, and for his fidelity, and that's the way that word gets translated in Titus 2:10, as I said, that construction of pistis. 4102. Instead, in the accusative case, that gets translated fidelity, and that's why I have it here. And for his fidelity to God became the inheritor of God's righteousness. You can see it gets a little tricky. If you just understand faith to be talking about trust, you're not going to understand it. Once you take it apart, once you understand the correct denotation is faithfulness, thanks to the context, we know that. And also because if you go with belief, you have to answer the question, belief in what? And you can't. I'm going to do 3 more verses here. Hebrews 11:8 from the KJV. Again, pistis. Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed. And he went out not knowing whither he went. So Abraham was just following orders there. Now let's see how this could read. For his faithfulness to be proven real, Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out not knowing whither he went. So how do you translate faith as confidence if the text says he doesn't know where he's going? What confidence could you have if you don't know where you're going? No, he went out of a sense of devotion, out of a sense that he needed to obey for his faithfulness to be proven real. Again, the King James Version, they translate it by faith to make you think, oh, by trust, Abraham, when he was called out to go into a place, that's why, because he was trusting. No, he went out for faithfulness. For faithfulness. That is both the reason, and it's also changing. Again, it's the indirect object, faithfulness. So it's affected, this noun itself is affected by what he does. For faithfulness. Faithfulness itself is changed by his actions, like an indirect object would be. You may have to go back and look at what I was saying earlier about indirect objects to get that. It's a subtle but important difference. But it's how we know that Hebrews chapter 11 is talking about the heroes of faithfulness, not the heroes of right think. All right, so I got 2 more verses, and then I'm going to close this part. Hebrews, let me go back up one here. Maybe I moved it around wrong. At any rate, I'll cut to the chase and go directly to how Hebrews 11, 9, and 10 should be understood. For Abraham's faithfulness to be proven unchanged. Again, instead of by faith, it's for faithfulness. He sojourned in the land of promise as in a strange country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. For faithfulness. And just as the author of Sirach cited the heroes of faithfulness, the author of the letter to the Hebrews is going to take 30 more verses to emphasize that those who stayed true to God were commended by God, and faithfulness itself is commended. He's writing not only about the heroes of faithfulness, he's writing about faithfulness itself. He's praising that virtue. So I hope the first 3 parts were sufficient preparation for that. Again, this noun pistis, faithful, faith or faithfulness. It's in the dative case. It's an indirect object. It should be translated for faith, or more explicitly, for faithfulness. Not by faith, not through faith, Faith isn't a verb in Hebrews chapter 11. It's a noun that's being personified. It's being changed by the action. That's why it's in the dative case. Okay. You may have to look at that again. I don't know. It's kind of tricky stuff, especially if you're not, really into grammar. I mean, we haven't studied this stuff since we were in sixth, seventh grade. It wasn't that interesting then. But if you really want to know what's being said in Hebrews chapter 11, you have to grasp that subtle thing. This author, again, was the most polished writer of all the New Testament writers. He had the most superior skills in Greek, in koine. He chose to put this noun in the dative case for a reason. He wanted to personify a virtue. He's heaping praise not just on the heroes of faithfulness, but on faithfulness itself. It's a way to encourage his readers. He wants them to admire faithfulness as well as the heroes that he's referencing here. All right, so one or two more parts, and we'll be done with Hebrews chapter 11. But I think if you've been through the first three parts, and if you sat through all of this one, congratulations. But I think you're beginning to understand this chapter the way I do. And if you're not, you probably clicked off of me a long time ago. I'll see you all soon for part 5. God bless.